Guys, so today we're going to talk about cliffs, rocks, and water. And what I'm going to start with is just a line drawing. So I'm going to take my brush and just a hard round pressure size. And this time I'm going to use a rather thin size for my brush and just pretty low opacity, like 25, 26. And not a black, but like a darker gray, sort of in that range, as you see here. And then I'm going to start a new layer just for the drawing, and then start drawing some little cliff forms, just the outlines at this point. What I want is, some cliffs that are in water, like oceanside perhaps, some rocks and things. Maybe the cliff that we're standing on right here, something like that. And then a little cliff back there, the water, the bottom of this cliff, the part that touches the water, and then let's say we're standing on like a cliff across from this one. That's where I want to put the camera. So I'm going to draw the horizon line here. And usually the horizon line, if you're dealing with water, is flat. So what I'm going to do is click, hold, and then draw the horizon line out with shift. So click, hold shift, and draw out. And then you'll get your horizon line. And then you could maybe use like a smaller, thinner brush to draw some mountains back there or something like that. But anyway, when you're done, it's going to look something like this. And that's pretty good, but now we need some details. Now we need to sort of map out where all the shapes and the values and the plane changes are going to be. So usually when I start doing this, I pull up a reference, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, and I start by just finding some really interesting looking lines that connect to each other, like the connection of this point, the connection of that point, this line and that line, and then I figure out where I can set in some sort of plane. And maybe there's like a landing over here. If I start off where these lines converge, for instance. So what I want to do for that layer is also start another layer. So let me start here actually and just draw out the bottom of it. And then I'll draw the top line so that you can see where the plane stops. Maybe that's like a landing where someone could walk. And then there'd be something like that here on this closer cliff. So I'm going to draw something like that. Maybe we can put some grass on there or some vegetation. This one you don't need too much detail. You just need a couple little doodads and things just to show that there's something going on over there. And then I noticed that there's a little wedge here in my original sketch. So I'm going to take advantage of that and draw down a little crack. Maybe this part of the cliff comes out like that. And then there's another angle here. One plane there on the left and one plane there on the right. There's sort of like a little dagger-like crag coming out. Then I want to find some other little scribbles and jagged edges coming out. And draw down. So drawing down from these interesting little kinks or twists and turns in the line work that establishes different things like planes and forms or shapes. By doing that, I can really get some nice little indentations and clefts and cracks and furrows. And places for shadows to hide in the rocks. So that's how I would draw some of my cliffs and their textures. Maybe there's some strata down here that we can put in later. But you basically want to start off like that, by just taking some lines and dragging them down from interesting little changes in the line work above, where the cliff maybe takes a turn, like here and there. And that's how I know where to place my detail lines and my changes in planes within the overall cliff outline structure of all the cliff shapes. The other thing to remember before we get into painting is you want to bunch lines together at the edges of your objects, especially if you're drawing something like a cliff. You want there to be a sense that this object is sort of curving around and away in space. So those lines are slowly going to be fewer and far between as you go back in space. But these lines are going to be bunched up, showing us that that's where the cliff turns around. The curvature of the cliff is, getting a little further back, receding. Same thing here, where I'm bunching up those lines because I want the cliff to look like it's turning in space. And here. That's why I got a lot of detail over at the edge, and then less over here. And then finally you would do that to this edge as well. Because this cliff, as you see right here, is in front of this one. So we need some lines there. But now, that's enough just to show you the gist of it, how to do that, add some details. And then I'm going to get rid of that layer and show you the more finished version of that, where I've sort of like a cooking show pre-drawn everything in there. And at this point, now, we're ready to add some underpainting values. So I'm going to leave that layer 1, which I just created, as, let's say, the painting layer. And we'll call it underpainting. And I'm going to use some dark blue. You notice that I started with this bluish gray for the background. And that's good enough for like a mid-tone or something, but we need some darks. And I want to keep working with those similar colors within that blue hue to establish some sense of plane changes and darker values. So what I'm going to do is bring up my brush size just a little bit, keep the same opacity. Let's bring it up to about 47 pixels. It's a hard round pressure size brush. And I want a pretty dark range value, the same value I chose for the outlines in the drawing. And wherever I see something that looks like a shadow or some sort of crack line or something like that, or cleft, or a little spot that was eroded or something like that, I'm going to put some darker values. We can always go back to this later and change these things. But you want to establish some darker values first. Turning down the opacity just a little bit. There's a bunch of dark values down here where I want there to be some sense of like different strata, different tiers of various types of sediment and stone. Right here we need some other darker values. Here as well. Right up against this next cliff right here. So this is the left side of the cliff. This is the side that I want to be facing the light source. And I decided that the light source should be coming in at a 45 from the left, the top left of the composition. So then in that case, I'm going to just put down some rough dark values just to show myself where, and show you where the darks are before we start talking about carving in some different planes and things and some plane changes. So this can be really rough. It's just the underpainting, and I'm using a hard round pressure size so I can get those sharp edges. And when those sharp edges touch each other, just like in watercolor, when they overlap, they're going to make some nice rock textures. That's why I'm sticking with the hard round pressure size and that sharp edge. I don't want this piece to seem too photoshopped and too airbrushed and all that. That's what you don't want at this point as you're learning how to paint things like cliffs. It's a little tricky sometimes, depending on what your drawing looks like, to figure out where the darks are going. Sometimes if you get stuck really, really far away from the light source, you want to grab a larger brush and just darken up the majority of your shapes, the shapes that are further away from the light source. And like I've been saying, you want to go from big brushes to small brushes. Always work with larger shapes, then small shapes, larger brushes, then your small brushes. And that's why I'm making sure that I use enough of my big brush before I get into details and smaller brushes. I sort of started with like a medium and a small brush first. So this is going to be pretty dark here too, as is this. But since this is its own layer, we can always change things later, erase or do whatever we have to do. That's why it's great to keep everything on its own layer and keep it organized and named and all that. This one is just going to be a pretty flat color. We don't have to worry too much about that one. So it might be a little easier to add some darker values in after I get some more mid-tones and lighter values and maybe even some highlights, but I always try to add the highlights in at the end. So why don't we start a new layer? We can always come back to underpainting and label this mid-tones. Okay. So now what I want is some sort of like tannish rock color. I'm going to decrease the brush size down to about 79, 75 pixels. And I'm going to try to put some mid-tones in there with this about an 80, 79 brush, low opacity, 15%. And I'm going to start over here on the left toward the light source. Always start adding in your lighter values after you put your darks down over toward the light source or on the objects where the light source is hitting. And what we want to do with this is make sure that we establish the sense that there's different planes, not just a line from the drawing and some dark values on the side, which can tend to look flat. We want some different landings and places where someone could stand, maybe like a mountain goat, or something could grow like grass. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different steps and things like that. Not only do I want that, but I want, some little sinewy lines coming down to show you where the light is hitting. And I want some of that over here too, some more of those little platforms or landings and things. And I want to keep some of the mid-tone value of the original flat color that I put in the background, that cooler gray. So sometimes it's great to put in like a little V here, a little V shape of mid-tone value of that rock color. And maybe the rock is curving up here in sort of an inverted U shape. And also, perhaps there are some little rocks that are meeting the water's edge down there. But you don't want things to look too uniform. You see how I have a 1, 2, 3, 3 similar shapes here, and then 1, 2, 3, 3 similar shapes of value there. You don't want that to happen too often because you want this to look natural. In nature, you don't see too many patterns unless you're looking at a creature or something, some sort of pattern on a vegetable or a fruit. When it comes to rocks and grass, you don't see too much of a pattern. You want it to look natural. So that's why I'm keeping everything a little chaotic and disorganized, so I can sort of find my way as I'm painting in these forms on top of my underpainting. And you'll see that this value that I'm using for the rocks and these little shapes and strokes get a little less frequent toward the backs of the rocks. That's a basic fundamental cliff rendering and cliff painting device, technique. So sometimes I'll zoom out just to see if it makes sense, if everything looks good, if I have any patterns or not, if I need to make things look more natural. But it looks pretty good so far. So I want to add a little more of that. And then we could always add to that later. I don't want to make it too opaque because I want to save that for the highlights. So I'm going to leave midtones as it is. And then I'm going to add another layer called browns because I need some browns in there to serve as just like the darker version of this color. So we want some of those browns in there. We don't want them to cover everything, but this will give us a good idea of how much darker we need to make the underpainting and or the darks. So I'm going to cover most of the underpainting with that brown. And I'm going to leave a little bit of that, blue from the base coat in there. But now, as you can see, I'm painting all of the right side shapes and planes, as opposed to what I was doing before, which was painting all the left side planes where the light was hitting. Everything's still going to look pretty soft at this point. At the end, that's when you start sharpening things up and adding details and making the rocks look more craggy and crumbly and firm and sharp and all that. So now let's go back to the underpainting, which can now sort of evolve into the darks. We don't really have to rename it, but I want these nice blues to show through now that I have a good idea of how light I went with the rock colors and such. Now you don't want your piece to look too modular. That's another rock painting and cliff painting tip. You don't want to, in other words, like paint a really, really dark value here, then a dark value there, and then you don't want to separate all the objects. You want the objects and the shapes and the crags and things at certain points to connect and not be entirely separated or modular. So that's why I'm leaving like this area right here. I'm leaving some of the more lighter values, some of the mid-tones, and I'm not going in there and darkening the space between this shape and that shape because I want them to feel like they're more connected. And that's going to make it look less modular. You want these darks not to be so much near the edge, but to the right, far away from the light source. And why am I using blue? I'm using blue because this is an environment, this is a landscape, and the sky perhaps is blue. So we want the shadows to reflect that. When you have a blue sky, chances are you're going to have these blue shadows. That most often happens because not only the objects in the distance or objects in the midground are picking up that bluish light in that atmospheric perspective, but the shadows are picking up that blue light as well from the reflections of the ocean and things like that. So that's why I'm darkening up a lot of these objects that are jutting out from the cliff with that darker color, with that nice dark blue, which is just the darker value of the base coat, which, as you can see down here, was my background filler. So once you're pretty satisfied with that, we can also come right back to that since it's its own layer. Then you can start working in some other things like maybe grasses and things like that. So I'm going to start a new layer, and let's move that layer to the top. And we'll call that layer vegetation. So just like in my other digital demos, I want to start with a darker value first. Just like I did with the cliffs and that dark blue. But now I'm going to start with a dark green. And I want a different brush. I want something like a splatter brush. So maybe like a 150 splatter brush. And on the vegetation layer, I'm going to go in here and maybe bring up the opacity just a little bit. Brush down a bit, down to a 125 because it was a little too big. And then I'm going to just pepper in some of that grass. If you're really concerned about where the grass is going and the shape of your grass patch, you can always go in there and just either use the regular lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool and just select where you want the grass to be. It doesn't have to be too perfect. That's not what we want here. As I was saying before, you want it to look a little natural. But we can always work within this selection and then get rid of the selection and push some of the grass outside of it. So let's go back to the grass brush and throw that in there. I'm just going to do like I'm going to paint like a large, pretty opaque coat of that dark green in there with a bigger brush. just to save some time with the demo. But I'm going to keep this brush for highlights and things like that afterwards. So, speaking of which, I'm going to move over to some highlights. I'm going to keep it not too saturated. But now I'm going to sort of stipple in some grass with a little bit of a smaller brush, so I get some nice little grainy textures. And you don't want to completely cover the grass. The darker grass underneath, rather. You want these stipples of, the spatter brush or splatter brush to be a little sporadic. A little more dispersed toward the end over there. But we can leave that as it is. We don't need to worry about this too much. What we need to focus on is this part right here. So what I'm going to do is deselect, and then now I have the freedom to move outside those boundaries, the confines of the selection. And I'm going to go to a little bit of a lighter value with a little more yellow, almost like an ash yellow or an ashy green. And I'm going to put in a little bit more of that grass there, just so it looks like it's growing up toward the edge. Since this is a landscape, the grass is pretty far away, so it doesn't need to be too complex and too detailed. Obviously, you're not going to see every little grass blade, but you want a lot of that grass to look like there would be grass blades if you walked over to that little landing and were to inspect the grass. So we're going to put a little bit of that grass highlight here because it's right up against this little fissure or crack, and the light is coming from the top left, so it's going to hit that. And then we're going to put some grass over here, coming over the edge, maybe a little bit here. And this is cliff grass, so oftentimes it's going to be growing off the edge and leaning down, almost like those Dr. Seuss cliffs with the grass that looks like hair that's hanging off the edge. But in this case, we have to make it look a little more realistic. And you do the same thing up here as well. So now, before we get back into, let me zoom out, back into the, sharpening the rocks and all that, and adding more contrast to the rocks, we're going to talk about the water. What I'm going to do here is go right back to that darker blue. I'm going to switch to hard round pressure size. It's pretty much a full opacity brush. So for this, I'm going to make a new layer, ocean. And I'm going to paint in that ocean here. Now I'm going to lower the opacity to make sure that I can sort of blend this sort of base coat or underpainting of water into the part of the ocean that's going to be really bright. Because this is just the reflections and the shadows of the cliff. So we could do this with something like a gradient, but We don't necessarily want to do that in this case. I'm going to show you how to paint it without that. That might be a little faster, but you see how using the hard round pressure size brush makes sort of like ripples in the water. And we want a little bit of that over here, but not too much. Because we don't want too much contrast in the background. We want most of the contrast to be in the foreground. You know, the hard edges and things. So now the cliff looks more like it's in the water. And we can come back in there and erase things away once we work more on the cliffs, but now I want to switch over to a lighter value for the water. I don't want it to be too cool. I want it to be a little warmer. So what I'm going to do is start painting in the part of the water that's catching the sunlight. And most of this water is going to be a little turbulent. It's going to be catching some wind. It's not going to be like this shadow, which is almost flat. We want to see a couple little ripples and things. So that's why I'm starting from this edge and using a very, very low opacity, like a number 6 as I move in closer to that shadow water. And I want a very, very distinct transition between the shadow and the part of the water that's catching the sunlight. We only want a couple little stippled marks here, but we want to maintain sort of like the threshold or the terminator between these two values of water. So with that low opacity, I can sort of build up this little transition and keep track of what it looks like and how the transition will flesh out and so on. You want all your strokes to be sort of stipple-like, but almost like little hatch marks as well. And you can see that I'm pulling from left to right, left to right, left to right as I work. At which point I can just go back to a higher opacity and fill in the rest of the water. You don't want too many patches of that original background gray. And you could always switch to a lower opacity just to feather everything out and make sure that you get a sort of like a darker value in the background toward the horizon. And like I said earlier, you can always go back into that layer since it's its own layer and just erase away what you don't want. So if any of that blue touched this cliff, I can just erase it away. If it touched this cliff, I can erase that as well. And And I'm going to zoom out to see what it looks like from a distance. And it's looking pretty good. So that's a good start to the water. I'm going to leave the water like that for a little bit. And then I'm just going to finish up here with some lighter highlights and things. So I'm going to switch to my color picker, my eyedropper tool, and go down to a little bit of a smaller brush, hard round pressure size, and pick a lighter value. So now I want to draw on top of my cliff details layer. Now let's just start a new layer. We'll call it highlights. It's always easier to do that because it's very forgiving to work that way. So now with the highlights, we're going to paint over the drawing and lighten things up, lighten shapes up to the right, and add in some tinier textures, little hard edges and things, so that the cliffs look a little more like cliffs. There's more cracks and things. And that's the key to drawing cliffs. You have to sort of think of what happens to cliffs over time. There's erosion, there's cracks, there's crumbles, there's footsteps, and there's animals and all sorts of things that move the rocks around, and make the rocks their home. And all sorts of little bits of weathering that I'm adding in. I put the ocean under that so that I can get some really light values here. And we want to highlight this because it's really, really close to light source. And you want some of those highlights in the shadows, but not too many. And you want a little bit of this as well, a little shape of dark, a little patch of dark between two highlights. You see the same thing up here, which is typical, a typical texture you'll see on cliff sides and on rocks and things. So I may have to come in and add some brown to that later, but that's all part of this. That's the beauty of Photoshop. You can just come back and add to any layer you want, because you can just bring that layer right back to the surface. Notice how I'm not bringing or carrying these values down to the bottom like this, because usually you want some shadows down there, and you want the tops of the rocks and the left sides of the rocks to catch all the light. So you could do that with just maybe one of the rocks, one of the little crags that juts out there. But you don't want to do that with every single value or strip that comes down. That's why I didn't do it over here either. It's another cliff drawing tool. A lot of drawing happens when you're painting. I'm drawing in all the different planes and things and details with color at this point. This way it's a little more spontaneous. So that's basically how I would add in some details and things. I might zoom in. And start using maybe like a soft round pressure size brush to get some softer values toward the right side of these different shapes. And to start to make some of the shapes a little more geometric, because now they're just like a series of circles and things. So that geometry is really going to make these rocks look like rocks. We don't want those little, dabs and circles in there. So that's why I'm just touching them up and making them look more like shapes instead of just low opacity, fixed width brush strokes, which is what you don't want. Unless you're doing concept art or something like that, which is fine. But let's say this is an illustration. Let's say you want the cliffs to look, like a painting, and more like something that goes on a cover, or something that's not later going to be, made into CGI or made as a matte painting digitally in the computer for an animation or game or movie. So now I can use that brown to fill in some of the shadows here, and also to color over certain parts of the rocks, so that the highlights of the rocks aren't all the same color. And you want to put that brown at the terminator, where the light value, the tan value, meets the blue, or where the highlight meets the shadow, even where the midtones meet the shadows. But you still want some of this blue to show through as well. And you want a lot of that blue to show through on cliffs like this. And that might be one of the last techniques I show you here. Let's say, I'm painting this rock here with one of my, typical rock painting brushes before I go into my rock texture brushes. I'm going to do the same thing I was doing before, painting the highlights, maybe taking a little bit of that brown, darkening things up. But you don't want to put too much contrast over here in this piece. You don't want it to look like this, where we have those darker browns and those darker blues. So I'll zoom out so you can see. You want it to feel like it's further away, and there's less contrast, softer edges, and things like that. What you don't want is a midground or a background object to have any of these darker values, like this. And remember, this is the same value and color as the water there, the shadow water. It's the same color as this part of the water, which is lighter, but it's just a darker value. So I'm adding a little more contrast to illustrate my point, which separates this from that. I can even go over some of my highlights and blue them up. But all the strokes I'm making sort of conform to the direction in which my shapes are going, or the verticality in this case. If I had a lot of horizontal lines and shadows and things, my brush strokes would be going this way. So that's a good thing to know. And during the daytime, you get some really high contrast lighting, so that's why I'm adding in a little bit more of that. And don't forget, you can always select the polygonal lasso tool, go in there, and highlight some of your shapes, and then select your color, and paint at the edge facing the light source. And then you'll have a harder edged object. Might be a little more clear right here. So let's go to the highlights layer, and I'll just show you. You see how there's a hard edge here, and I'm not painting over here, so I'm leaving the soft edge. We've done this before, but now I want those really hard rock edges, which is what I have here after using the lasso tool. But I usually use the lasso tool after I've thrown down some paint, so that I have a clear idea of what the shape should be that I'm lassoing, like this one. I'm sharpening that one up too. Now we have a sharper shape there. And I'll just do one more before I end the demo here. The right side of the selection doesn't matter because we're just painting on the left side toward the light source. So then we get a harder edge there. And that's how you get some of your harder cliff rock edges. So anyway, that's basically the cliff demo. If you have any questions, ask them in the comments section. I'd be happy to answer them. And that's pretty much it for today. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.